Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and Lecture 14 of the Harvard Classics. We now are going to introduce you to John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, right away, let's go ahead and just say a couple of things out loud about this classic text that ends up in this classic volume number 4, right after the information that we've already presented on Milton's poetry. We are met with this amazing text. This is one of the classic texts of all time. To me, I remember a number of years ago, I was actually lecturing this poem, and a student said, "Mr. McGee, is it possible that I live by the park, and when I was younger, it seems like I remember you were walking from the park with your kids, and one was in a stroller, and the other one was walking beside you, and you had a book in your hand that you were reading out loud. Is it at all possible that it was this poem?" And I said back, kind of incredulously, well, yeah, actually it was. What else are you going to read to your children when you're at the park with them swinging, other than maybe Whitman's Leaves of Grass? Now, the way I like to teach Paradise Lost is this, and I'm going to share this with you. We are getting an introduction to this poem right now. We're not going to cover everything. I'm going to give a single lecture for every single book of this poem, all 12 of them. However, don't take my word or anybody else's word for this as being a great or a classic text. What I challenge you to do is what I've already said to you in earlier lectures about some of the other texts from the Harvard Classics that we've covered already. Don't take my word for it. Listen to what I have to say about the text. Engage in the text yourself, and then you make some decisions about whether you think this is a legit text or not. I'm going to make the argument that I think it is a legit text, and I'm going to make the argument that I think you will be moved by this. In fact, some of the stuff we're going to cover right now, just in the introductory comments, are going to challenge you already, and I hope that's the case, and I hope that you enjoy it. Read it aloud to yourself, fall in love with the language, with the poetry, and I hope that I'll be able to help you do that. All right. Let's give a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this lecture. First, I'm going to review some biographic information just to make sure you're all on board there. Then we're going to talk about where does he come up with an idea like the one that he comes up with in Paradise Lost. By the end of this lecture, you're going to understand basically the summary of what happens, the plot summary and that kind of thing, and that's what I'll do next. I'll talk about really the kind of three-part division, and scholars, guys, I'm saying nothing in this lecture that's new, original with me. So much of this poem has been exegeted, discussed, interpreted, and I'm drawing on all of those kinds of works, as well as some of my own ideas and many ideas that have been gained from my conversation with students as I've talked about this poem. It's fascinating to me the way this poem continues to speak. We'll talk about then the three-part division. Lots of scholars have seen this, that it's a 12-book project. Started out as 10, ended up as 12, that divide rather nicely into 4 books of 3 sections, and we'll talk about why that kind of works out. Then I want to share with you the 3 ways that I will be sharing this poem with you. Beginning with, we'll study this as a literary work. It's what we call an epic poem. We got to talk about what that means. We'll talk about this as a work of philosophy and theology, answering the question of theodicy, and we'll define what we mean by that. And then finally, we're going to look at this as a political work. Clearly, Milton has an agenda, and we're going to look at this agenda of his from a psychological perspective, study of the human mind, and from a sociological perspective, the study of the group at large. We'll look at all of it. Finally, at the end of this lecture, we'll set up our study of Book 1 of Paradise Lost, and we'll get ready to converse about that. Let's begin, and I hope you're taking notes, as we always do, and as we will begin our process, of course, with Book 1 here later, and the reading at the 3 levels. Let's go ahead and begin now with some biographic information. Now, already in my Harvard Classics for lectures number 11 and 13, and again, all of this is accessible to you at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, just find the Harvard Classics link, and then you can see my earlier lectures here to help you. But already in lectures 11 and 13, I've been talking already about some of the biographic information from Milton. Milton as prose writer in lecture 11, Milton as poet in lecture 13. Just some quick review, though. Born, of course, 1608, dies in 1674, that amazing 66 years of life that he lived. prodigious education, which is going to play right into this whole project of writing Paradise Lost. As we've already said, that studious retreat, as he called it, from 1632 to 1638, where he, along with his then Italian travels, gains prodigious knowledge. I mean, the guy was just so unbelievably well read. But like I've often pointed out when I lecture Milton, it's one thing to read a lot. I think you'll agree with me on this. It's one thing to read a lot. It's another thing to have a memory that can call back all of that reading. I mean, imagine if you could actually remember most of the stuff that you've read since you've been in school. Whoa, right? Milton has that capacity. Of course, a linguistic polymath. He knows multiple languages. He reads the Bible in the original languages, as we said. From a very early age, he was already practicing writing poetry in other languages, like especially Latin. And so you have this amazing kind of creation in his mind that will then help him to begin to think about writing this really important poem, Paradise Lost. Now, I've said in an earlier lecture, what I believe to be true, and other scholars as well, Milton is a devout Protestant Christian, but more than just devout in his practice of Christianity. He takes his study of the Gospels and his reading of the Gospels personally. I've already commented on the importance of the Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30 passage called, again, the parable of the talents. A father leaves 3 sons, different amounts of money. The first 2 sons translate that money into more money, and for that the father rewards the sons. But that 3rd son, who's given a smaller amount, says, I was afraid I might lose it, and so I took my money. Of course, in the 1611 King James Bible, the word translated for money is talents, and so you can understand why this is going to be an important story for Milton. And the 3rd son says, I didn't want to lose any of the money, so here it is, it's all back, same amount. For that, the father in the story condemns the youngest son, and this is an important moment, I believe, and others believe, in Milton's thinking. He recognizes he has prodigious talent from a young age. The obvious question is, what does God expect from me and all my talent? The other thing we've said about Milton is he has an unbelievable amount of ambition, right? It's one thing to read Homer's Odyssey, Homer's Iliad. It's one thing to read Virgil's Aeneid or Dante's Divine Comedy. It's a whole nother thing to say, I'm going to write something as good as. It's even more amazing to imagine that you would say, I'm going to write an epic poem better than Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. Oh, better than Virgil's Aeneid. That's what we mean by this level of ambition. He wants to go beyond his own father, his own biological father, and, as many have pointed out, he wants to go beyond his own literary fathers. I've mentioned them already. Homer, Virgil, Dante, even although living just at the end when Milton was beginning his life, even Shakespeare. Whoa. It is, of course, the great Paradise Lost, the great Protestant epic in English. You want to underscore that as well. And for that, usually considered the greatest poem in the English language. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that will be contingent on how well you read the poem, and that's why you're joining me for this discussion. Important dates. We don't like to do this a lot, but I think there's some important dates for you to write down. February of 1652. With all of that ambition, with all of that information about the Matthew 25 passage, feeling the weight and the responsibility of what am I going to do with all this unbelievable talent I have. 1652, February, early in the year, at the age of 44, Milton loses his sight. He goes blind. 1658, when he's 50, he begins writing his great masterpiece, Paradise Lost. Almost 60 years old, 1667, the first version of Paradise Lost is published as 10 books, 10,000 lines of poetry. Whoa. 1674, we have the second edition. The division is made into 12 books, which of course now it's going to make it look very much like Virgil's Aeneid. Okay? Now, I know you're already thinking it, so I'll ask it out loud for you and then I'll try and answer it. Dude, how does a blind man write 10,000 lines of poetry? Whoa! Answer? Well, he obviously can't write it because he can't see, so what does he do? He dictates it. He recites and dictates out loud. Sometimes to his daughters, sometimes to friends, to an amanuensis or a secretary. Along with this, while he's writing this poem, he is ill from gout, has bad health. He is mourning the death of his second wife, Catherine Woodcock, in 1658. And he's also mourning the death of his infant daughter. By the way, he does remarry in 1663. Now, let's turn to the question of Paradise Lost specifically. Where does Milton get his idea to write this important classic poem, Paradise Lost? Well, the first thing we want to say in your notes is that originally, we believe, his idea was actually not to write the poem that he ends up writing. He knew from his reading of the great epics, right? Of the Iliad, the Odyssey, we've already said, of Homer, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, of which, of course, Inferno was the one that usually as school students we know the best. He wanted to write something important, and that meant writing an epic. Originally, though, he thought he would write, as many epics are, we think of Beowulf, don't we, right? As a story about a great heroic king, like Arthur. But over time, he begins to come up with a different idea, and we, of course, are the recipients of this different idea. He goes to the text of all texts for Milton, as a practicing and believing Christian, the Bible. Now, if you pick up the Bible, and I've given lectures, of course, on the Bible elsewhere, but if you pick up the Bible and you open it, you immediately recognize that the first book of the Bible is the book of Genesis, although related to origins, yes? In the opening chapter of Genesis, we are told about the creation story. In the second chapter of Genesis, we are told about the creation story, part 2, some have called it. The creation especially of Adam and Eve. And then in the third chapter of Genesis, we are going to get what we call the Eden story, sometimes referred to by academics as the Eden myth. Now let's get this word myth out of the way. We're not using the word myth, if we talk about the Eden myth, we're not using the word myth to talk about a story that's true or false. We don't get into that debate because we are studying literature. When we use the word myth, we use it in the same way that we use it when we talk about Greek or Roman myth, a story to explain the unexplainable. What unexplainable? That's a good question. Let's turn for a moment and let's look at the Genesis 3 story. I will be reading from the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. I mean, get the dates there. 1611 King James Version of the Bible. I've given lectures on this in detail elsewhere. But 1611 is an important date. I mean, think about that in relationship to Milton's birth in 1608, yes? We'll take a look now at the King James Version of this story. Of course, this story is translated in many other kinds of translations in English and elsewhere. But we'll go ahead and, just because it's the beautiful 1611 language, and of course it's going to be the language that Milton is knowledgeable of, although of course he could translate this out of the Hebrew himself. And let's just read this story. One of the reasons I have to do this is because many of my students who I'm lecturing this poem to have never read any part of the Bible. They didn't grow up in a religious environment at all. And so when I mention, for example, the story of Eden, they don't really know at all what I'm talking about, or it's kind of fuzzy to them. So let's go ahead and just look at what is really the genesis, no pun intended, of Paradise Lost. It will be a story that builds from Genesis chapter 3. So let's take a look at it. If, by the way, you have your computers in front of you and you want to go online really quickly and find this so you can read along with me, I would recommend it. Genesis 3, starting at verse 1. I will not, however, designate 1, 2, 3 as verses, but I'll just read the story. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of both of them, and the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee thou shouldst not eat? And the man said, The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin, and clothe them. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent them forth from the Garden of Eden, to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. End quote. Now, about this story, all kinds of questions immediately resurrected. And although we don't have a lot of time to go into detail, and I've given a full lecture on this elsewhere, let's go ahead and just point out a couple of obvious questions, observations. Did you notice, for example, that in our story of 24 verses, that a snake is mentioned, but Satan is never mentioned? Go back and take a look at the reading again. Well, everyone knows, who knows this story at all, that the snake in the story is actually Satan. Surely we know that. This is, of course, an interesting discussion. You can Google this for yourself and just simply ask, how does anyone who reads the Bible know that the snake in the Genesis 3 story was actually Satan? It's fascinating to study the Bible itself. Remember, it's on our reading list for a reason during our summer reading, yes? Because not so much always what's in there, but what's maybe not in there. For example, Revelation, the last book of the Bible, interestingly enough, chapter 12, verse 9, and chapter 20, verse 2, actually makes a couple of references to Satan being a serpent, and out of that, often is referenced this snake as being, in fact, Satan. Of course, the primary reason that we in the West know that the snake is, of course, Satan is Milton's Paradise Lost. He's going to make a big point about this. Notice, for example, as well, in our reading, no mention of the word fall, no mention of the word sin, which is kind of interesting. Of course, readers of this text, like St. Augustine, the great theologian, will point out that it's implied and clear that God is clearly upset with the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and therefore there is a fall because they both have sinned. Self-evident, you might say. What about this question? Who is to blame in our story if you read this as a fall? Do you blame the snake? Do you blame Eve? Do you blame Adam? Do you blame God, the creator of this special fruit that one was not supposed to eat from if one was named Adam and Eve? Of course, we have other kinds of questions as well. For example, I'll just leave this one. I mean, this passage is replete with questions, and obviously it's great ground for Milton to begin his poem. But how about this one? If you read this story as a fall, as Adam and Eve falling, sinning, as of course Milton will read it, then the obvious question is, what do you do, for example, with verse 22 of this reading? At the end of the story, we are told that God says out loud about Adam and Eve and their sin or their fall, now man has become as us, knowing good and evil, to know good and evil. Which begs an interesting question. If eating of the forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if eating of the forbidden fruit is a bad thing, sin, a fall, then was man and woman more like God before they sinned or after they sinned when they had eaten from this forbidden fruit? How do you read this word now? Do you read it like, now man has become like us, knowing good? Or do you read it as, yes, now man has become? How do you read these?